Thanks so much for making the time to join us today for our Cotton Australia's webinar to look at the topic of biodiversity, one that's very close to my heart. My name's Brooke Summers and I work with Cotton Australia on the Cotton to Market program. I'll be facilitating the session this afternoon. I'm looking forward to some really great interaction. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we live and work, whichever country you happen to be on today. I'm here on the beautiful Gadigal lands in eastern Sydney and pay my respects to all Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging. I'm being ably assisted with the technology today by John James, and I'm excited to introduce your panel very soon. For those who don't know, Cotton Australia is a not-for-profit organisation and the peak body for Australia's cotton growers, representing around 1,500 cotton farming families. But before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. Today, we're going to start with a short presentation from each of our panellists with an opportunity for your questions after each speaker. Then we'll move into a session which will be a facilitated Q&A and discussion around all things biodiversity. We've already got some fantastic questions from when you registered your attendance. The session's being recorded and the series is brought to you by Cotton Australia and a grant from the Australian government, for which we're very grateful. So today we won't be using the chat function, rather we'll be using Poll Everywhere for your questions. So please let me hand over to John to explain how that works.
Yeah, hi folks, lovely to have you along here today. Using Poll Everywhere is a very democratic way for everyone to ask their questions. So if you've got your phone handy, scan the QR code. I'm sure we're all familiar with that now. And if that doesn't work, then you can just quickly do a Google search for Poll EV and you just tap on the Poll EV that comes up on your screen and then you just type in MM Forum. It's as easy as that. So we're curious to know where people are coming from today. So if you can tap on the map. So yeah, so that's interesting. The map's not actually showing. So we won't worry too much about that. So instead, we'll be asking you to use this to ask the questions, and I'll just get that fixed in just a moment.
John, sorry,
yes, Brooke.
If you can hear me, I'm not sure if everyone else can see this, but I've got a big black sort of blotch over the presentation.
Yes, I've got that too.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, there's it's kind of obscuring the
How about that?
QR code.
Is that showing it now?
It's showing.
There's a line.
So there's the QR code there.
So there's also a black sort of stripe now along the bottom there. So there's some part of the QR code is obscured and we can't, I think people will struggle to, oh, there we go. That's better for me. It's
sure. So that's the naughty Zoom software. So the control panel is supposed to be hidden from that, but instead it was obscuring it. So thanks for letting me know, Brooke. So folks, there's the QR code. And let me just test this on my phone as well, just to make sure that that works. So you'll get the little pop-up QR code there. And then when you tap on it, and I move to the next slide here, that should actually be presenting a map of Australia, but that's not happening for me.
No.
Yet when I tested it earlier, it was doing it. So I don't understand what's happened there. That's technology for you folks. So I will look into that, but I suggest, yeah, that we just move on to the next presentation. Okay,
no worries. Well, we might come back to that, John, just in terms of how people will be asking their questions once the presentations are into it. So just today's the third in our series, and this one, of course, is called Farming with Nature, Why Biodiversity Matters. We know the world's biodiversity is under threat. And then invasive species, land clearing, pollution and climate change are all contributing. We know that an estimated 1 million species in the world are threatened. And we know the problem is getting worse and that this issue is really important to our customers. So as producers of food and fibre who work with nature every day, what do farmers think about these issues? What even is biodiversity? What do we know about it in terms of Australian cotton production? And what can be done to help? Well, luckily, we have a fantastic panel of experts to help answer these and any other questions you have today. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our first panellist, Stacey Vogel. Stacey is the Natural Resource Management Lead for the Australian Cotton Research and Development Corporation and the NRM Technical Lead for Cotton Info, the Australian cotton industry's national extension team. She lives in the rural community of Weewaw in northern New South Wales. Although, well, she normally lives in Weewaw, but unfortunately at the moment, Stacey's trapped on the other side of floodwaters and can't get home. But Stacey's been working with the Australian cotton industry and its growers to manage biodiversity on cotton farms for over 20 years. I'll hand over to you now, Stacey. Thank you.
Thanks, Brooke. Good afternoon, everyone, or morning, depending on where you're logging in from. Brooke has asked me to give an overview of biodiversity in the Australian cotton industry. So firstly, what do we mean by biodiversity? Biodiversity is a variety of life forms found in the environment, including animals, plants, bacteria, fungi, and microorganisms. The term biodiversity also encompasses how these different life forms interact and function, often referred to as an ecosystem. So on this aerial photo of the cotton farm in northern New South Wales, we can see 3 different ecosystems. The Riparian corridor following the river, composed of different species of grasses, shrubs, trees and aquatic plants that are supporting lots of different terrestrial and aquatic animals. The adjacent water storages that are adjacent to the river, which are supporting water microbes, insects, fish and lots of different species of water birds. And then the brown and yellow areas, which are the cropping fields. And they're supporting soil microbes as well as insects and birds which feed on the crops or on the animals which are sheltering in the crops. And these 3 ecosystems form one large biodiverse ecosystem, which is the Australian cotton farm. So agriculture and its rural communities, including cotton, are totally dependent on biodiversity and how different elements of biodiversity interact to form processes and functions that support agriculture. Our survival depends on biodiversity as some of its elements provide the critical life support systems that make human life possible, including the air we breathe, climate regulation and the production of fresh water. Biodiversity provides us with economic returns, for example, the provision of food and fibre, natural pest control, as well as crop pollination. It is also an essential element of regional tourism, as a lot of our natural areas draw tourists into our regions to spend money, helping to keep some of our small rural cotton communities economically viable. We also know through social research that many of our rural people, including our First Nations people, obtain positive mental health, cultural identity and recreational activities from elements of biodiversity. For example, much of Australia's sense of place comes directly from biodiversity, and you only need to look at some of the names of our local sporting clubs to get evidence of this, such as the Tamworth Magpies or the Narrabri Blue Balls. Cotton growers as custodians of land and members of rural communities generally want their enterprises to be ecologically sustainable and have minimal environmental footprint so that when they pass the farm onto the next generation or business, it's in a better condition than when they received it. According to research undertaken in 2019 that benchmarked biodiversity on cotton farms, 17,000 kilometres of rivers and streams and around 6,000 individual wetlands occur on cotton farms. About 21% of the average cotton farm retains native vegetation, which is composed of around 348 different types of vegetation, with about half listed as threatened ecological communities. And one of the most extensive vegetation types are river red gum woodlands, which occur along all the major rivers in cotton landscapes. And the photo in the bottom left-hand corner is of a river red gum on a cotton farm, and that's Dr. Rhiannon Smith from the University of New England standing beside it. And that river red gum is estimated between something like 800 to 1,000 years old. 197 species of Australian birds, 279 threatened species of animals and plants, and over half of Australia's 70 species of microbats have been recorded on cotton farms. And the photo in the bottom left-hand corner is of the very adorable Elsie holding a shingleback lizard that she found on her cotton farm in southeastern Queensland. In addition to benchmarking biodiversity on cotton farms, we've also, as part of the Cotton Landcare Tech Innovations Project, been identifying high priority areas and management practice to target for restoration and revegetation works that benefit threatened and iconic species. The web-based tool allows growers, you can just see my little marker here, that allows growers to click on their local government area to access biodiversity benchmarking data for their region, as well as recommended management actions that they can undertake to protect biodiversity on their farms. In addition, growers can access maps that can be used as a guide for where on their farm they can undertake revegetation works, which is shown here by the olive green areas, or restoration activities such as riparian fencing or weed and pest control, and that's shown by the orange areas here on the map. Managing biodiversity on farm is really challenging, and actually it does depend, regardless of whether you're a farmer managing biodiversity or part of an urban land care group, it is really challenging. Climate variability is one of the biggest challenges that farmers face in managing biodiversity in farm. In the past 20 years, cotton regions have been in drought for over half that time, impacting growers' abilities to undertake revegetation and restoration work, as lack of water has made it difficult and challenging for them to plant new vegetation and to keep existing vegetation alive. In addition, major flooding events, such as what we're seeing in southeastern Queensland at the moment, have negative impacts, including destruction of thousands of kilometres of riparian fencing put in place to protect riverbanks from stock, introduction of environmental weeds from upstream, and also significant loss of tube stock planted along riverbanks. And this first photo is a heartbreaking photo that a farmer sent to me of his tree and tree guards that he and his family had spent weeks planting and watering, floating away on floodwaters. Another major challenge is the time and cost associated with controlling invasive species such as feral animals and weeds. A study by Flinders University estimated that invasive species have cost the Australian economy $390 billion over the past 60 years in damage to crop or livestock and the combined cost of management. 18 billion of this was spent on feral cat control alone, as feral cats are responsible for killing around 1 billion native animals a year. Weeds are another big challenge threatening our environment. A study by the Weeds Cooperative Research Centre estimated that farmers are spending a minimum of $68,000 per year protecting threatened plant species. Over the past decade in Australia, we've also been seeing declining biodiversity government support services, especially in our regional rural areas. Biodiversity and its management is complex and varies quite significantly between different cotton regions, and our farmers aren't ecologists or environmental experts, and they're increasingly finding it difficult to access regional technical advisory support, financial support, or consistent information to help them implement biodiversity management on farm and have the confidence that what they're implementing is actually improving condition of biodiversity. So what are we doing as an industry to support our growers manage biodiversity on farm and overcome some of these challenges? We're investing in research, developing innovative technology and tools to better manage biodiversity on farm and measure biodiversity changes over time, such as developing acoustic monitoring sensors that can be deployed on farm to identify a subset of microbat and bird species that we know are conditions of biodiversity condition on farm. We're developing usable extension products and tools that maximise research outcomes, such as the Birds and Cotton Farm Identification Management book. And we're forming partnerships with regional natural resource management groups to align the cotton industry to regional biodiversity targets and actions to better coordinate and collaborate for biodiversity impact at a regional scale. We're also forming partnerships with NGOs such as Landcare Australia and Country Road, and with regional local Aboriginal lands councils who are using cultural knowledge and skills to develop services for growers such as native plant nurseries. So that's a very quick, brief overview of biodiversity and the cotton industry. I'm happy to take any questions. Over to you, Brooke. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Stacey. Yes, that was a very short, sharp whip around biodiversity for the Australian cotton industry. I know there's it's a huge body of work for our industry. So thank you very much for somehow condensing that down into a short presentation. I just did want to mention that I hope everyone's got the PolEv QR code going okay. Please put in the chat if you're having trouble with that. Please let us know so that we can put the QR code back up again. But I've certainly got a number of questions here for Stacey that came through the registration process as well. So I might start with some of those. One of the questions was, how do cotton farmers tackle biodiversity when there's a monoculture crop like cotton?
Well, if we think about the field, so cotton is actually an annual crop, so it's only grown or in the ground for say 6 months of the year, and it's generally grown in rotation with another crop. And so if we think back to that aerial photo that I had at the start of my presentation, as you move out from the field as well, that there's a lot of other biodiversity that's occurring on farm, and a lot of our farms have native vegetation, and we have birds and plants that interact in between the fields and in those riparian areas and on the water storages. So it's not really a monoculture.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying that it is very possible to manage biodiversity within the cotton farming system.
Oh, definitely. And there's lots of different areas of the farm that we growers are managing biodiversity, such as their riparian areas and their soil health and, their water storages. Yeah.
So just for people who don't know, what is a riparian area and how are those types of areas being managed on farms?
Yeah. So sorry about the lingo, guys. You get used to it. A riparian area is a vegetation corridors that follow a river or a creek. So it's just that vegetation corridor buffer that you see. And so in terms of managing, as I mentioned, there's a couple of different things. One of the things is around feral animal and weeds. So they're managing weeds and feral animals through different management actions and working with the local NRM groups to do that. One of the challenges in terms of keeping riparian areas healthy and stopping erosion is stock and stock accessing water. And so things like fencing, so they're fencing off riparian areas so stock can't get down there and cause erosion. Undertaking revegetation to better connect areas, so that we have areas in the landscape, either in the riparian areas or even adjacent to that, and farmers are actually undertaking revegetation works to better connect those areas. And those maps that I showed you earlier, some of the tools that we're using to better determine where we're going to best have that impact. So, and then lots of different management actions, but they're the 4 priority ones: are weed and pest control, fencing to stop stock impact, and revegetation, and managing stock's impact.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great. Thanks, Stacey. Just on the fencing, you mentioned that with the recent floods, there's been some damage done to some of the biodiversity works, like fencing and some of the plantings and things like that. I can only imagine that is incredibly heartbreaking to farmers who put a huge amount of effort and their own money into that. I had 2 kind of questions around that have come in. One was, is there any government assistance available to help farmers kind of recover from those types of shocks that we're going to see more of during the era of climate change? And how do you remotivate farmers to get back in and get excited about biodiversity again when those types of things are happening?
Yeah, so yes, there is financial support services available for growers or for farmers to do riparian fencing. I guess the thing is, though, that unfortunately a lot of those services are disappearing. There's not probably as much around as there used to be, and so it is an expense that the farmers often have to take on board. Often they can get funding to initially put the fence in, and then it's up to them to maintain those fences. So that's one of the challenges that farmers have, is that while it's not just initial cost, because you will get floods in riparian areas, it's just part of the system, and so they have to continually maintain those fences, and in some cases replace those fences. So motivating them, I guess it's not really about me motivating, it's that they realise that those fences are important in terms of managing those areas. And so they just weigh up, I guess they're weighing up and saying, look, I need this, we need to have these in place and replace these, because if we want to be ecologically sustainable, we need to do this. There is research that they're doing at the moment, looking at whether you can put sort of chips within domestic stock that, discourage them from being in parts of those landscapes. And so R&D is looking at ways that we can make this cheaper for growers in the future. And Andrew might say something later on. I know he has challenges with these sort of things, but he might touch on those in his presentation.
Yeah, okay. There is another question that's come through around the challenge of water, but I think we might leave that one till a little bit later in the session because I know Stacey's very focused on the biodiversity and NRM issues in the industry, but we will definitely get to that question as well. There's just one more, Stacey, before we move on, and that's just around the tapping into the Indigenous knowledge and experience of our Aboriginal people in biodiversity. You did mention it a couple of times in your presentation. Can you just tell us a little bit more about how the cotton industry is engaging with Indigenous people on biodiversity?
Yeah, and I say up front that this is an area that we probably haven't done as well in the past, and we acknowledge that. And we are, the Cotton Research Development Corporation that I represent, it's one of the things that we're looking in our strategic plan is about how we can do that better. And we acknowledge that it's an important contribution to our regional landscapes. And so what we've been looking at doing is working with local Aboriginal Lands Council. So they're the group that represents the interest of Aboriginal people in rural areas. And we've been working with them to find out, what is it that you as a group are trying to achieve and what are the services in your capacity to manage biodiversity in particular. And so we've then just been looking at programs where we can help them, like running a plant propagation workshop where they were helping us identify plants, as well as then potentially setting up a nursery, which is what the group wants to do, and that would provide a service to growers in the future in terms of providing plants. And I know Sydney University is also doing stuff around native grains, and so they're looking at like making flour out of different native plants using cultural methods, and they're working with local Indigenous populations to actually develop that sort of cultural knowledge and share that further. And so there's some great programs happening.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. Thank you so much, Stacey. We do need to move on now, so I'm very pleased to introduce our next panellist, Boggabri cotton farmer Andrew Watson. Andrew's a 6th generation mixed cropping and cattle producer, and along with his wife Heike, he farms 3,600 hectares in the Namoy Valley, which is west of Tamworth in New South Wales, growing crops and stock with a focus on long-term ecological and economic sustainability. Andrew is an industry leader and a fantastic champion for Australian cotton. So please welcome Andrew. Over to you.
Thanks, Brooke. Welcome, everyone. I get to talk about my farm, which is quite an easy thing for me to do. But so our journey, I guess I want to talk to you about our ecological journey, which includes my parents who have been on the farm since 1965 and 1968 respectively. But the photos there you can see, that's us harvesting cotton, and that's my family there. Next slide, please. So just a quick description. We grow multiple crops. Stacey mentioned cotton's not just grown year after year continuously. It's grown in quite a large rotation these days, and for us, we sometimes have it in about 1 in 5 years. And we put these other crops you can see: chickpeas, sorghum, corn, barley, and wheat. The background picture's a picture of our farm when it does rain and it's green. It doesn't always happen like that. And we've got about 5 staff. Next photo, please. Next shot, please. So our farm sort of evolved a lot as we've managed to sort of maybe pick up some neighbouring properties at times. So the top photo is a riverbank that used to be grazed. So the stock would go down to the river, drink the water, and then come back up the bank. And it was continuously eroded, and the soil and this water you can see has always been a muddy colour. And so we've had a focus of if we're grazing those areas, we fence those areas off and then replant them with native trees and grasses and shrubs. And that's the same bank 40 years later, and you can see it's quite a beautiful site. It's actually, that's only 30 years. It's 10 years ago that photo was taken. So we've looked to really do that with replant along the riverine corridors to fix them up, but also removing non-natives like willow trees. And, willows have a really bad impact at times, dropping all the leaves at once, creating nutrient imbalance that leads to things like algal blooms, which you probably heard about. Next slide, please. On my next slide, again, once we wanted to move from, where do we go from just at the river, we wanted to start moving and planting trees in tree lines through the farm and around them. And historically, the cotton industry had a reputation of spraying a lot of chemicals. And so some of the plant lines we planted 25 years ago were to try and manage spray drift off the farm. We certainly leave the old growth timber and fallen trees because that provides habitat for many animals, owls and bats, etc. But what we found after a while was these tree and shrub lines were providing a habitat but a highway for birds, bats and insects to move through our farm, right across our farm. And the way we were measuring that was to measure it in the crop, is to see how many birds, bats and insects we're finding in the crop. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, James. And so it didn't matter the crop we had. We were linking these tree lines to, and there's a few in the backgrounds of those photos, depending on whether it was dry or not, it looks different. And we did a lot of work supporting research. So I must admit, there's probably been about 35 PhDs done on our farm in the last 50 years. And I guess we just incrementally picked that information up. But I guess the outcome of us trying to increase the biodiversity has led to, there's only been 4 years in the last 17 when we've had to spray crops like cotton or canola for insects. So we've managed to control them with just the native insects. And so that to me is a real step. It's never going to be the entire answer, but it's a real step for us. Next slide, please, James. So beneficial insects to us are fantastic. And I've just a few photos I've taken on my farm. Top right is a predatory shield beetle eating a Heliothis caterpillar. Now they can decimate our crops. The left-hand side is a spider eating a mirid. On the bottom is a cotton harvesting equipment there with spider webs just draped over it. And that doesn't happen every year, but there's some years spiders just go ballistic. And there's a lot of ladybirds there in a wheat crop, which help chew out all the aphids, which would then suck the plant dry. So beneficial insects are good. Now, next slide, please. And so I guess for us, the next step then was, sure, we're providing this base load of beneficial insects, was what if we could use technology to augment the amount of beneficial insects? And so for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been using drones to release beneficial insects into our crop to combat specific insect pests. And that drone on the left there, that tube, has the insects in a carrier material like rice hulls. And when it's flying, that tube rotates and there's holes in it and the insects just fall out across the field. The graphs are great, but this was just some research we did in the first year. Going across is sort of the time frame a cotton plant is growing, and going up the graph, the higher up the graph, the greater the density of the pest insect. And so the red dots are the things I'd like you to focus on, because they're the healthy insects that are surviving. And we released the beneficial insects, which is a Hayati wasp, right at the beginning of the graph. And the concern is the number of red insects will just climb up in that red high risk zone, more and more density throughout the year. But as you can see with the red dots, it just declined and declined and declined until the last dot's not on there, but it's actually a 0. So we got complete control in that particular year of this insect called a silverleaf whitefly, which puts honeydew on the cotton, makes it very difficult to spin, and certainly downgrades the cotton. So we're able to do that. We've been using other insects to control different pests in the crop and also in corn. So that's certainly the next step for us, been quite interesting doing that. Next slide, please, James. John, sorry, getting your name mixed up. Don't worry about the detail here, but my point was, I, like many other farms, continue to trial everything we can every year. And a lot of this stuff relates to what's actually in the field. But, don't worry about the detail, but the point is we just have multiple trials trying to work out things. The aerial shot there is we're looking at putting a cover crop. So that's when we're not growing cotton and the field's in fallow. If we're to grow different species of plants in the interim, does that help the soil microbiology leading into the next cotton crop or corn crop or whatever we're growing. And so it's just an example of all the things we do. I mean, the green ones are the only ones I've had success in. Sometimes they've gone backwards like the red ones. So but that's what we're here to learn. Next slide, please, John. So I'm out in the country here, so my slide's moving pretty quickly. So in the actual cotton industry, my BMP is the Australian Cotton Industry Environmental Management System. So it's a set of things that we have to follow and get accredited for. And it's an independent audit for this. So the program drives a lot of what we do. You know, tree plantings, soil microbiology, riverine health, beneficial insects are just some examples. And it's recognised by an international standard called BCI, which is the Better Cotton Initiative. And I guess the point I'm trying to get to with this is we are currently achieving a $5 a cotton bale premium. But a lot of this stuff costs money to do. And so there needs to be some help. As I say, as Stacey was saying, the government incentives to help are certainly going backwards. And so there needs to be some incentive to help us to do a lot of these programs. Anyway, so my BMP is the current, and it's changing all the time. If there's better practice identified, my BMP recognises. So we've certainly been registered in that program for a number of years. Next slide, please, John. I think that's about it. And so that photo is a photo of family and friends. We've been planting trees last year along the Namoy River on our river frontage for 3.7 kilometres. And that was in conjunction with Landcare and Country Road Australia. Now, we laboured for a whole year to plant that, every weekend going out there and planting 3.7 kilometres, about 1,300 trees. The recent floods in November came through and took out all but 58 of those trees. And that, as was highlighted earlier, is pretty gut-wrenching to do all that. And one thing I'll commend Landcare Australia and Country Road is they've backed up to say they'll help replant them, which is just a wonderful thing. And so, in summary, I guess what we're trying to do is good farming practice. We're trying to measure it, and we're trying to value it, and we're trying to work better with nature. But there's an underlying point here. If we can't make a profit, we won't be here to do this. And I think that's just a point I have to keep reiterating is we need to be profitable to be doing this. And my question to, I guess, all the audience here is, how do we get consumers to understand what we're doing for farming ecological sustainability here? I'm happy to leave it at that. Happy to take questions.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, geez, you're really doing such a lot on your farm, and you're to be commended for that. I know that's been decades of hard work by you and your family. So congratulations, and thanks for sharing your story with us today. We've got a really good question through the poll, Ev, so please keep your questions coming, guys. This one is about beyond the great work being done along the riparian zones, and you did touch on some of this already. Are many cotton farmers looking at integrating regenerative farming practices like intercropping, no-till farming and cover cropping to try and, I guess the intent of the question is to try and integrate biodiversity into that production system? And you did touch on this, Andrew, but can you kind of talk a little bit more about some of those other practices mentioned there?
Yeah, sure. Intercropping. So zero-till farming is a major part of what we do on most of our area. One of the things about irrigated farming is there is a requirement to get quite a lot of fertiliser in to grow the yields we grow, to make use of the water and to value what we do. Certainly we've been focused a lot on, and I know a lot of people is using manures rather than chemical fertilisers as fertiliser, and that's proving very, very successful for us. But one of the things about using all those things is you actually need to incorporate it in the soil profile. If you put it on the top, it won't percolate down very quickly. So the idea of using zero-till in cotton is certainly been tried a lot over the years, but we run up against the flip side of how to manage what we need to do with nutrition to grow the crops we do. But I would say that when I say to you we're looking at best practice, everything we do in our dryland farming scenario, which includes cotton, certainly involves things like zero-till farming and things like that. I've had a fair look at intercropping and polycropping and all of these things. None of it's easy, and so that's why I guess it's still only going to be experimental for a long time, and there's a lot of risk involved. But I can tell you that won't stop us trying it. I mean, there's many things now that are now commonplace that used to be risky. So we would hope that in the future we can incorporate, I guess, more of what people see as sustainable. I mean, I've been pretty focused on making my farm sustainable. I've got some young kids who want to take it over later on, hopefully a little bit later on. I've got a bit more to do. So I'm certainly making sure that I want my farm to be sustainable, and I think that's replicated by every other farmer I know.
I mean, you mentioned the amount of trials that get done in the cotton industry. I can tell you that there are trials for all of those things, and looking at some of those other regenerative practices as well. But like you say, it's different in different parts of the industry as well. So it's very important to test these things well before we sort of launch in. But no, thanks for that, Andrew. I just wanted to, there was just one other question here about, and it kind of links into what you're saying about you need to be economically sustainable to be able to be a good biodiverse farmer. Have you noticed any kind of positive impacts on your productivity or or the economic side as a result of all of the work that you've been doing in biodiversity over the years?
Oh, certainly. And that's, again, this is the stuff we're doing. We're trying to prove that being as ecological as possible can also be economically sustainable. And I guess for years we've been able to keep our costs lower by trying to use our what we call ecological services, our birds and bats and ladybirds and everything, and reduce the amount of cost of chemistry, labour, and I guess machinery by using these natural predators to help us. So that's certainly been a tricky balance to get to, but I think we're starting to get there, and I think it's starting to be a good thing. So yes, there are ways we can prove that ecologically we're doing better, and economically we're certainly being as sustainable, if not better. Okay.
Thanks, Andrew. We're going to just need to leave it there for now, as we need to move on to our final panelist, but we'll come back to some other questions in the open session later on. But thank you very much, Andrew. And so last but not least, let me introduce James Link, our final panelist. James currently manages the Corporate Partnerships Program at Landcare Australia, where he plays a lead role working with organisations to develop mutually beneficial partnerships that drive positive environmental and community outcomes. James has over 15 years' experience in the not-for-profit environment sector and has recently helped bring together a very exciting partnership between Landcare, the cotton industry, and Country Road Group. James is going to tell you all about it, but actually before he gets started, we're going to show you a short video. So James, sorry, but we're going to jump in with that video first, and then we'll get you to present next.
G'day, I'm Andrew Watson. My family have farmed here at Boggabri since 1965, and my wife and I have taken over the farm from my parents. Oh, isn't that good? The project we're involved with Country Road involves planting 3.7 kilometres of tree lines along the Namoy River. This is on a property we've recently purchased. The banks were denuded and high river flow was actually causing turbidity in the river. So by doing this, we're going to increase the ecology along the riverbank by planting trees and grasses and trying to get it to be a much more stable environment.
If we get some good season, they could be this high within a year. In the 70s, we had lots of floods and the riverbank was washing away badly. So I decided to plant corridors of trees along the riverbank to try and stop that erosion. Once the trees started growing, we found that the biodiversity of the whole farm became much more intense, and it's given us great ecosystem services with the cotton growing.
Cotton, along with all the other crops we grow, do have pests that predate and cause trouble with those crops. And so previously there'd been a lot of control work using chemicals. And one thing for me is I don't want to use chemicals unless I have to.
Oh, you blokes had enough?
And the idea of being able to have beneficial insects actually kill the pests in our crops rather than have to use chemicals is one that is just majorly appealing. I think we're starting to really prove that there's an economic outcome as well as a massive ecological outcome. And we're really grateful that there are organisations like Country Road and Landcare who are willing to help fund these works, which actually are improving the ecology on all our land.
All right, just make sure that screen is sharing okay. You can see that, Brooke?
No,
Not
James,
yet.
not yet. You might need to.
They're good. I'll try again.
Yep.
How's that?
Good to go now, mate.
Lovely. All right. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks Brooke for inviting me to come and talk to you all today. As you can see from Andrew's video there from Country Road, I'm really here to talk to you about the Biodiversity Project that Landcare Australia, Country Road, and the cotton industry have been working on for about 1.5 years now. But first of all, I'll just start by explaining who Landcare Australia are. So we're a not-for-profit organisation that exists to support the landcare movement. So what's the landcare movement? Basically, it started in 1989 nationally. Bob Hawke was successfully lobbied by the Australian Conservation Foundation and the National Farmers Federation at the time. It started off in Victoria a bit earlier than that, and it was really farmers and conservationists coming together to address environmental issues in the landscape. So in Victoria, it was dust storms that were coming over Melbourne, and in other areas, issues like soil salinity and other things that were impacting on the landscape. And really, Bob Hawke announced the decade of landcare in 1990 and wanted 1,000 landcare groups at the end of the decade. And there was something like 4,000 groups at the end of the 90s, and there's now 5,500 landcare groups all across the country. Half of them are in regional and rural areas still, where landcare's roots firmly are, and the other half are in urban areas now. Landcare's got a big following in urban areas with local friends of groups and so on. So we really try and bridge that city to country divide, and I think that's helped us a little bit in this Country Road Biodiversity Partnership. So in terms of just a little bit more about the Country Road Biodiversity Program. So we're working with a couple of farmers to start with, and we're looking to work with some more in the coming years. It's a 3-year partnership. Country Road have dedicated $600,000 to the program over those 3 years. And we started off with the Carl family back in October of 2020. And it was really interesting. The program had been talked about for a little while, and in the planning for a little while before then. And obviously, due to COVID, it had a little delay. But coming out of those first lockdowns, I guess at the end of 2020, Country Road recognised that this project was a really important way of re-engaging with their customers when they reopened after those lockdowns, and it was seen as a really important initiative. And they certainly found really good feedback from customers through not only what was presented in store, but what was presented on websites and in social media and so on. So I'll just explain, I guess one of the key things about this was Country Road's willingness to invest in the storytelling, recognising that biodiversity is not necessarily a term or a concept that's understood fully and widely amongst their customer base. So we found it really refreshing that Country Road invested in the storytelling side of this. And I've just got some images to show you from the Country Road website. This first one here is of Daniel Carl, one of the first farmers that we engaged in the program. And I really like this photo. He's writing down there a list of the people that have planted trees, that were planting trees on that day, the sort of the first day of the program, and where they're planting them, so that in years to come, when they come back and visit that farm, he can show them, here's the tree that you planted. You helped me contribute to the biodiversity on my farm. And I guess it just reminds me of how important it is for these farmers like Andrew, who you've just heard from, and from others in the area, that they engage with people, and they're just really thankful for any support that they can get in this endeavour. I guess Country Road have utilised Landcare Australia and our CEO, particularly, and other experts within our organisation and within the cotton industry from CRDC and Cotton Australia, to help add credibility to what they're saying around biodiversity. So they've got the story from the farmers, from Landcare Australia, from the cotton industry, to be able to help tell a different perspective on what it is that what biodiversity means to different people and why it's important to different sectors of the community. So here's an example from James Carl, the father in the Carl family. He's got 3 sons, and through the storytelling on their website, they've done interviews with the various boys and the sons in the family to understand from their perspective why it's important. Some are interested in the aesthetic appeal, and they grew up with the biodiversity and the animals in the region, and they want to provide that for their kids growing on. Others, might have more of a lens around the productivity benefits for the farm, as Andrew was talking about, some of the integrated pest management and bringing those beneficial insects onto the farm. The Carls in particular tell a great story. They like to look out at dusk over the crops and see the microbats flying out over the crops and picking off the insects that are causing problems for their crops, and they can see the benefits of the investments that they're making in this over time. And again, drawing upon Landcare Australia's CEO to be able to spend time to explain what it is that biodiversity means. And it's not just the farmers that are benefiting from that biodiversity. So bringing the story to customers, Country Road have been able to talk about how it contributes to reducing global warming. There's obviously carbon that's being sequestered through tree planting in these riparian zones. It also obviously helps with mental well-being and physical well-being. We did a report last year with KPMG that looks at the well-being benefits of getting involved in land care activity. And we found that there is actually economic benefits from the avoided mental health and physical health care costs from farmers and land carers that are getting involved in this kind of activity. And obviously the wildlife benefits are enormous as well. So it's important to tell that well-rounded story when communicating to customers about this. I mentioned the CRDC and Cotton Australia, so working with Stacey and the team at CRDC through all of the research that they have done. Some of those, that Cotton Landcare Tech Innovations project that Stacey mentioned earlier, has been really important to draw on that research. So we've been looking at the areas that they've identified through that research to decide which farmers we would like to work with and target areas. So making sure that we're making investments in biodiversity enhancements in areas that need it and have a good chance of success of improving the condition of biodiversity and improving habitat for threatened species in particular. And that's helped at the start of the project in terms of choosing projects, but it's also helped enormously in the storytelling aspect of bringing consumers along for the journey. So talking in detail about, for example, here, 192 bird species that exist in cotton landscapes and 279 threatened plant and animal species that have potential to be impacted if we're investing in biodiversity programs across cotton growing regions. And just to sum up, I mean, Andrew talked about the importance of profitability for farmers in biodiversity investments. And it's also true that it's important, I mean, for companies that are investing in this and corporates to also be profitable. through this program. So ensuring that that's happening for Country Road, they've linked this biodiversity program back to their verified Australian cotton heritage sweats. And that's really important. We find that all of our partnerships that link it back to a product or link it back to a business imperative makes the partnerships last longer, get buy-in from people within and leaders within those organisations. So, look, Country Road have also invested in telling the story across their Instagram and in-store. We've had really great feedback from people in-store and on Instagram. The posts about biodiversity generate more and more interaction with their customers than other posts. And also we get really good feedback from people that are in-store that are skilled up to talk about the projects. They're getting great feedback from customers as well. And I guess just to finish off about thinking long-term, here's a couple of pictures about the flooding impact that Andrew mentioned. This is a 3-year program that we're working on with Country Road, and having the support to be able to support farmers to do a replant if things are lost due to flood is it's certainly not the norm. If you're working in a government funding arrangement and to fund these things, you might get a grant to put these plants in the ground, and then once you've spent that grant, there's no more money. In this program, we're able to change tack a little bit, think long term, understand that we've had a flood event, we're going to go back in and replant, and that's really important for engaging people in the area. I might leave it there and pass back to you, Brooke.
Yeah. Thanks, James. Yeah, really fantastic presentation and a really wonderful project. I feel very honoured to be part of it. So thanks for sharing that with us today. I've got a couple of quick questions for you, James, and then we'll only have sort of 5 or 6 minutes left for the open session. So let me just quickly crack into it. One of the questions we had during the registration process was from somebody who was asking, apart from the Country Road type model, where there's product and funding and that sort of thing, is there anything else that we could do as a brand to encourage biodiversity in fashion?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, encouraging customers to get involved. I mean, Landcare, as I mentioned, Landcare operates all across the country, so just encouraging people to get involved. I think also working on your supply chain management and looking at your supply chain and where you're sourcing product from and asking questions about biodiversity and I think it's really important to make investments in that supply chain. If your customers are starting to demand this kind of activity and they recognise brands that are investing in that. So can only encourage people to invest in this for the future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess follow on from that is, you mentioned government support and corporate support, but how important do you think these types of partnerships that include an industry like the cotton industry and a corporate and government and an NGO like Landcare Are to try and tackle some of these huge global issues together and really get some traction on them?
Yeah, look, no one's going to be able to do this alone. There's so much area and so much loss of biodiversity that's occurred from a whole range of reasons, whether it's climate impacts, urban development, urban sprawl, agriculture. There's impacts on biodiversity, and there are a lot of wins out there that can be had. And when organisations work together to tackle those, there's certainly much more gains to be had. I think, if we went in and chose a farmer in a cotton industry, to take this Country Road example, if we just went directly and spoke to a cotton farmer and planted some trees on their land, we could have done that and told the story. But having all of the players involved and having the cotton industry involved, having Country Road involved, allows us to broadcast this message out and get it out to more cotton growers and encourage people to come on board along the journey. So that's really important.
Absolutely. Thanks, James. I guess just following on from that, Stacey, I might just bring you in. And sorry, it started absolutely bucketing down here. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Timing, of course. So Stacey, just, that idea of using a project like the Country Road one to get even more kind of farmers enthused about biodiversity, how important has that been and is that the case? Is that happening in the cotton industry as a result of this project?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that cotton farm, and this is not just cotton farmers in general, is that they want to be good stewards and they also want to be able to tell their story. And it's very difficult for them to be able to tell their story. And so partnerships like this give them the opportunity to be able to demonstrate to others, not just in the the general public, but also in their communities that show that we are managing biodiversity. This is how we're doing it. And these are the great things that we're achieving, or these are the challenges that we're having. And, let's talk this through and find solutions to manage this better. So this partnership with Country Road and Landcare has been really helpful, I think, in getting growers, I guess, helping growers find ways that they can actually demonstrate to others the type of stewardship that they're doing on farm for biodiversity.
I guess while we're on the collaboration type train, Andrew, I might just call on you for a second. And one of the things that just occurred to me is around that kind of connectivity issue and how important it is to not just do this work in isolation, but to also have your neighbours doing this type of work, so that, as Stacey mentioned, you can connect these really important pieces of remnant vegetation together. How do you find working with your neighbours out on your farm, Andrew? And what are some of the challenges in getting some of your neighbours to see the benefits in the same ways that you are?
Now, that's true. So I did talk to you about willow trees, and the fact that they're probably not great. They cause a lot of swirling, and when the river runs heavily and it washes out the other bank, and the drop of their leaves at the wrong time and create blue-green algae. But I struggle a bit with a neighbour who's called his farm the Willows, to encourage him to take them out. There's a time and a cost to all this, and I guess we were just so enthusiastic at Country Road's participation in this. We've been planting trees for, I don't know when my mother started, but every year we would try and plant another tree line somewhere. And in the 3 years of drought, we got about 300 trees planted, and 200 died. We managed to get 100 planted again. But so that Country Road investment and their help and their enthusiasm meant that we punched out 1,300 trees planted with the help of friends and family and a few school visits and people in the industry. And that was just fantastic to see that connection. Now, that's also, I'm getting neighbours saying to me now, I think I might do a bit of that, just because they see the effort we're putting in. And we've got our original farm, which has got trees that have been there for 30 and 40 years. And the landscape there is just amazing. That video we had my mother speaking, unbelievable amount of birds in those trees behind her, and different birds, multiple different species. So I think you've got to have some examples. It's such a long-term thing. It's quite hard to sort of do it in 1 or 2 years, but there certainly are plenty of examples out there of people who have been doing this for a long time.
I guess it is hard to get governments to see long term. And here's a follow-up question for you, James, exactly on that kind of thinking. And this has come from one of the registrants, which is about, you can have all the kind of intention that you like, and you can have a champion within your brand who's really keen on biodiversity. But how do you get the management team on board? How do you get the decision makers within your business to also invest in these types of programs that are really long term, and they're not going to sell product necessarily for 30 or 40 years, as Andrew has mentioned? And I guess you see this in lots of the different models you use for Landcare Australia.
Yeah, we do. We've got about 25 to 30 corporate partners, and having that leadership buy-in is so important. I guess the ways that we try and encourage sustainability managers within these brands or brand managers to get other people on board is give them first-hand experience, get them out to sites if you can, Sometimes getting out to a cotton farm might be hard, and if that is hard, then get them out to an urban Landcare site. They're not hard to access. Running corporate volunteering days is a huge part of what we do. Take thousands of staff through that program a year, and always, even in that sort of a scenario, getting people involved within the business to come down. If they know a leader's going to be there, then they'll get on board as well and want to be a part of it. So I think if people have that first-hand experience, then that goes a long way.
Yeah, I can absolutely agree with that. We run a farm tour once a year for brands and retailers, and it's certainly made a huge difference when they get out and get their boots dirty and have a look for themselves. Now, I'm really sorry. I realise it's 4:01 and we're going to need to wrap it up, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to our wonderful panellists for sharing their expertise with us today. It's really been wonderful to hear all of these different perspectives shared today. And also, of course, to all of you who gave up an hour of your precious time to share in the discussion around this very important topic for us. We've got more webinars coming in the following month, so stay tuned for those. And we're really looking forward to having more conversations with you around the issues for cotton and the environment in the coming year. So I'm going to need to leave it there, but thanks very much for your time, everyone. And we hope to see you next time.